In this video, I'm going to be explaining every single graphics option for the DuckStation emulator, and more importantly, showing you what they actually look like, with side-by-side examples. So by the end of the video, you know what you're setting, why you're setting it, and if you should be setting it in the first place. It's been almost a year since my previous DuckStation video, and as per usual, we've got a bunch of new stuff to cover. On top of that, I want to seize the opportunity to focus on the things I've skimmed over in the past, mostly downsampling and par 1:1. But do expect this video to be the most in-depth one yet, with a bunch of new information. So let's just get into it. So we're going to start at the top with renderers. Now Automatic will set whatever DuckStation thinks is best for your specific hardware, and that's great for plug and play and for users that don't know what their hardware supports or have a preference. However, a lot of us do have a preference and know exactly what our hardware can do. And in that situation, Automatic is not the best choice because it makes the decision for you and it might not be the one that you want. Now I'm just going to quickly break the full hardware renderers down to help you make a decision. So DirectX 11 is the best all-rounder, good compatibility and performance across the board, making it perfectly fine for most users. Now DirectX 12 is mostly here for compatibility reasons, as there's some awkward hardware out there that favours or only supports DirectX 12. But if you have the choice between 11 or 12, you should probably go with 11 because it gets more dev time. Now Vulkan is by far the best performer. You'll be able to apply more enhancements and do more upscaling before hitting the performance barrier. And also with Vulkan, you can set the internal resolution to a massive 32x, in comparison to the other three that let you go to 16x. OpenGL is the most compatible and accurate out of all four of the hardware renderers. One thing though, it doesn't perform as well as the other three, but if you've got good hardware, that really doesn't matter too much, making OpenGL for sure the discerning choice. Now software, of course, is not a hardware renderer, and that's because all rendering is taking place via your CPU in software, which for reasons makes it the most accurate option you can use, but simultaneously one of the most performance intensive. So if you're one of these people where emulation accuracy and keeping the graphics looking original is your top priority, software is for sure the best one to use. But do keep in mind when you select it, you lose access to the majority of the enhancement options because there's no hardware acceleration, essentially locking you to everything the PlayStation originally used. But you can still use shaders with it and you've still got enough options to make it look appropriate for a digital display. For myself, I tend to prioritize Vulkan or OpenGL, depending if I want accuracy or additional headroom for extra enhancements. But of course, just go with your preference. And if you're unsure, just go with Automatic. With Adapter, don't leave this on default. Select the main GPU you actually want to use so you're not leaving anything to chance. With internal resolution, increasing this arguably makes your graphics look better, as it's actually cramming in all of those additional pixels for whichever resolution you set. And the general rule of thumb is to set this to your screen resolution if you're upscaling, as going beyond it is for the most part total overkill. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to go from 5x all the way up to 16x. There is a difference, but nothing to write home about. So if I change this back to 5x, again, you can't really see too much difference. Downsampling is a massive subject and its applications are vast, so we're going to keep it simple and relevant to DuckStation, starting with adaptive. Now one of the downsides to increasing the internal res is that it can make 2D stuff look a little bit rubbish. However, if we apply adaptive downsampling, it will take the 2D stuff only and downsample it to 1x and apply super sample anti-aliasing. So effectively, you're getting the best of two worlds. A low resolution for the 2D stuff and 3D stuff is left well alone at the higher resolution that you've set. This should really only be used for games that use a mix of 2D and 3D, whether that be in-game graphics, games that have HUDs, or a heavy use of menus. But if your game is just pure 3D, you don't need to use this. But do keep in mind that because of maths, adaptive downsampling will only work with these resolutions. Now Box is different because it's downsampling the entire image, not just the 2D stuff, and its applications are pretty wide. But the main reason people use this is to downsample their fully enhanced image all the way down to 1x for a more authentic feel, kind of like applying a shader to a fully enhanced image. And we also get the added benefit of super sample anti-aliasing. Not everybody's going to be into this kind of thing, but of course you can do whatever you want. And if you are looking to downsample the image, doing it here rather than in shaders is much preferable because it is taking place in hardware. Now you can also use box downsampling for purely anti-aliasing and upscaling reasons. There's a multitude of different ways to do this, but I'm just going to show you my preferred way. So you want to pay attention to the edge of this box. The line is pretty straight, but we do still have some jaggies. And even if I set the internal resolution all the way to 16x, 16x, unfortunately it doesn't remove them. However, if I activate box downsampling all the way down to 4x from 16x, it significantly reduces those jaggies, pretty much removing them entirely. Now I don't need to downsample to 4x if I don't want to. With this resolution I can also downsample to 8x, but as you can see that introduces jagged edges back into that box just ever so slightly. And that's because the greater the distance between the internal resolution and your downsampled resolution, the more anti-aliasing is applied. So if I put this back down to 4x, it removes those jagged edges again. Of course, setting the internal resolution to 16x is pretty costly. So instead, for example, you could set it to 9x and then downsample to 3x, which will give you a similar result, but it's much kinder on your performance. But ultimately, you can set this up to however you want. And it's all about finding the sweet spot between the internal resolution and the downsampled resolution for your specific taste and/or performance. But do keep in mind using box downsampling does soften the image in comparison to what it was. And the lower you go with your downsampled resolution, the softer it will become. But a lot of us, including myself, actually kind of prefer it that way. However, I know there's going to be some that want to retain the full resolution that they've set internally and not soften the image at all with downsampling. And if that's the case for you, you can still apply anti-aliasing just in a different way. And we'll be covering that later on in the video. Another really important thing you need to know with box downsampling is that, again, because of maths, each resolution can only be downsampled to certain resolutions. For example, these 3 resolutions can only be downsampled to these resolutions. For myself, whether I'm using box, adaptive or not using it at all is completely dependent on the game's graphics, which is why I leave it disabled by default and only set it up on a per game basis. And I tend to always keep my internal resolution to my screen resolution by default, and only increase it if I'm using it in conjunction with box downsampling. Now, one of the excellent features of DuckStation is that you can change the texture filtering for both 3D stuff and 2D stuff independently. Now, because there's loads of these, it's easier just to show you it in real time. And we're going to start with the 3D stuff, which is this texture filtering option. And the edge of this box isn't particularly exciting, but it does perfectly convey exactly what I need it to. So nearest neighbor is what the PlayStation 1 originally used, and effectively it's no filtering whatsoever. And as you can see, it's producing perfectly square pixels. But if we set this to bilinear, Jink2 or XBR, as you can see, they significantly smooth the image. So bilinear is a basic smoothing filter and it does do an okay job, but it does significantly reveal texture edges. Now Jink2 is a bit more demanding, but it does smooth things out a little bit more and it's a bit more contrasting, but again it does reveal texture edges. And XBR doesn't really reveal those texture edges, but in my opinion, it makes it just look like a cartoon. If you can't already tell, I am not a fan of these smoothing algorithms, which is why for the most part, up until recently at least, I would always go with nearest neighbor. And that's because I want my PS1 graphics to retain some of that chunky pixelated look. However, recently, Stenzek added these 4 new ones at the bottom. These are not smoothing the textures, they're scaling them instead. So we get to give the appearance of higher detail whilst retaining that pixelated look. So when I set this to 2x, as you can see, it takes those pixel edges and scales them by 2. And scaling these by ×3 does exactly the same thing, only it's scaling it by ×3, further refining those edges. Now MMPX is closer to 2x scaling, but it is doing it in a slightly different way. And as a result, can look quite different depending on the texture. And the enhanced version does look a tiny bit different, and in my opinion, isn't worth the significant performance hit. So for myself, it's between scale ×2, ×3, MMPX or nearest neighbor. And I fully recommend you leave it on nearest neighbor by default and change it per game if it looks any better, because for the most part, good old nearest neighbor just looks the best. Now there are some games that don't like bilinear, Jink2 or XBR, and will bleed over with some texture edges like you see with these leaves in Silent Hill. So if you're using one of these and you spot this issue, you need to switch it to its no edge bleeding variant to fix that issue. When it comes to filtering in 2D stuff, this is under Sprite texture filtering, and this contains all of the exact same filters that we've just covered, and all of the same advice still applies. So here's a close-up image of Jill's face with all of them, just to give you a side-by-side comparison. Now dithering was an old school technique intended for CRTs. It would apply a dithering pattern that the scan lines on your TV would have helped to have merged, smoothing out those gradients. But on modern digital displays, this dithering pattern looks absolutely terrible, which is why true color is set by default, as it's removing the dithering pattern entirely. However, if you're using the original resolution or you want to keep things looking authentic, you can add it back in. So if you set this to unscaled, it will add that dithering pattern back in at its original resolution. And if you set it to scaled, it will scale the dithering pattern to the internal resolution, which will lessen its appearance but not remove it entirely. If you are using the dithering pattern, you've got the shader blending variants, which will add the dithering pattern back in using shaders, which is technically more accurate, however it is more demanding. But to be honest about it, I can't really tell the difference between the two. So if I switch between these, only the pixel peepers will be able to tell the difference. But for the most part, I recommend that you remove it entirely with true color, especially if you're upscaling enhancing using a digital display. Now, most PS1 games use a progressive scan image, but there are some games that were made for 480i high resolution, and that of course means interlacing, another old school technique intended for CRTs that does not translate well over to digital displays. And this deinterlacing option helps out with those 480i games specifically by removing or merging those interlacing lines. Most of these games are going to be just fine on progressive, but on the very rare occasion it might not work, in which case you could try one of these instead to see if it helps out any better. It's not a case of preference, it's just what works the best. Now we can move on to aspect ratios, and Auto Game Native has changed since last time. Before it would present an image that was just slightly narrower than 4:3, but now it appears just to be set in straight up 4:3. So this Auto Game Native option and this 4:3 option are essentially identical. So if you want 4:3, go ahead and set Auto Game Native. Now you may have noticed that some games like Tomb Raider 2 look a little bit squashed, and that is essentially because they are. That is until you set the aspect ratio to par 1:1, which is presenting perfectly square 1:1 pixels, otherwise known as pixel perfect mode. As you can tell, this significantly widens the image, with this game pretty much all the way into 16:9. However, everything in this image is proportionally correct. As you can see, Lara's features are now actually in proportion and circles are actually circular, not oval, which is all the confirmation I need to know that this image is correct, not this. And getting a wider image natively is an excellent bonus. Now what you're going to find is that some games are correct with par 1:1 and other games are correct with 4:3, so do expect to have to set this up on a per game basis. And if par 1:1 does this to the image, obviously it isn't correct, in which case you need to set it to Auto Game Native. Do keep in mind the games that are correct in par 1:1 are going to vary with their image widths. For example, Gran Turismo 2 is correct and wider in par 1:1, just not as wide as Tomb Raider 2. So definitely expect that variance with par 1:1. With widescreen, there's a few different ways to do it. The first of which is to stretch the image, which I absolutely hate. But if you want to do it, just use stretch to fill. Instead, I like to present a proper anamorphic image, which means all of that extra stuff is actually being rendered in on the sides. The first and best way to do this is just to play a game that natively supports anamorphic widescreen. There's quite a few of these despite the generation they were made, and I'll put a link for a list of these in the description below. Just remember to set 16:9 here and then go to the in-game options and set widescreen there. Nice and easy. For games that don't natively support widescreen, you can use Widescreen Cheats instead. Widescreen Cheats are game specific, so what you want to do is select 16:9 here, right click on your game and go into properties. And as you can see, we've got cheats on the left hand side. Go into this and make sure that enable cheats is active in the top left hand corner. Now the widescreen cheat is generally towards the bottom, so go down, find it, make sure that you activate it and then hit close. And all you need to do from here is just start your game. Do keep in mind there's loads of games that don't actually have a widescreen cheat, and some widescreen cheats are region specific, so if it doesn't work, it's more than likely because you have the incorrect version. If your specific game doesn't natively support widescreen or have a widescreen cheat, you can try to use widescreen rendering instead, otherwise known as the internal widescreen hack. This is more of a general solution than it is game specific, and as a result, some games are going to work with it just fine and others are still going to have some pop in. However, recently, this option has come on leaps and bounds and now works more often than it doesn't. And where in the past I find myself shying away from this, it is now a totally solid solution. But I fully recommend you check to see if your game has a widescreen cheat first and then use this if it doesn't. If you're using this, again, make sure 16:9 set, but you can also use this with 19:9 and 20:9 if you've got one of those devices. If you are using widescreen, the FMV sequences are going to be stretched, and you need to force 4:3 for FMVs to stop that from happening. And whilst we're on the subject, FMV Chroma Smoothing will help to smooth out the colour blockiness that is inherent with those FMV sequences. Not by much, but it's definitely better than nothing. One more CRT thing that we got to deal with is the overscan area. This is the edge of the image that would have been physically covered over and hidden by the bezel on your CRT. This overscan area basically acts as a buffer zone to make sure the image is actually inside the viewable picture space, as TV manufacturers and components back in the day were not consistent. So a buffer zone needs to be created to account for the multitude of inconsistencies. And game devs at the time handled the overscan area differently from each other, so it can vary game to game. But most opted just to have black bars in the overscan area, because why bother wasting precious resources presenting pixels that aren't even going to be seen? For these types of games, it's recommended to crop the overscan area, as you're getting rid of those black bars, zooming in the image and making better use of your screen real estate. However, there were some game devs that just completely disregarded the overscan area entirely and put some stuff in there that you're actually meant to see. So if you crop it, you can't see it. And of course, for these games, the crop needs to be set to none. But an excellent new feature with DuckStation is that it knows which games these are, and it will set none for you when you launch a game that requires it. Now, other game devs definitely factored in the overscan area when it came to text and HUDs, but opted not to use black bars, instead displaying the entire image all the way to the edge, including in the overscan area. And for these types of games, you've got the choice. You can set the crop to none, in which case you're actually seeing more of the image than what you would have seen back in the day, but with some dodgy HUD placement. Alternatively, you can crop them as intended, which will improve the HUD placement and zoom in a little bit. Now, cropping all borders by its own admission states that it may not display correctly, which unfortunately I can testify to. I haven't actually managed to find a game that it A, doesn't break and just stretch the image, or B, actually work with and crop all the borders. Your experience with this could be completely different to mine though, but I can't really recommend it or even comment on it if I can't get it to work. So I recommend you go with only overscan area by default and let the emulator set none for the games that need it. Now with these scaling options, even though they're not, you can kind of think of them like they're shaders, because they are changing the image on output, and their effects are much more noticeable at lower resolutions than higher resolutions. So I'm going to show you this at the original res just so you can see the difference. So bilinear smooth is what is set by default, which removes the harsh edges off of those pixel edges. But if I set this to nearest neighbor, which is no filtering whatsoever, as you can see, it reveals all of those pixel edges and provides you with the sharpest possible image. So if I change this back to bilinear smooth, you can really see what it's doing for the image. We've also got bilinear sharp, which is just a sharp version of bilinear, and we've also got Langzos, however you want to pronounce it, which is sharpening the image just in a different way. With nearest neighbor and bilinear, we've got these integer variants, which will scale the image in integers, which is technically more accurate, but it does reduce the viewport size, so I tend to stay away from them. For me personally, I set bilinear smooth for 3D games and nearest neighbor for 2D games, because for 2D games, I want those pixels to look super sharp, but this just comes down to personal preference, so just go with the one you think looks the best. Now, just as I was finishing up the video, I've updated DuckStation and we've got another brand new feature. So the scaling options that we've just covered can now be applied to the FMV sequences independently. So for example, you can have all of your gameplay stuff to nearest neighbor and your FMVs to bilinear smooth. PGXP geometry correction is the thing that stops 3D polygons from wobbling and warping about. This does work for the majority of games, but just don't expect it to work for all of them. And just to give you a better idea of what's going on, here's the wireframe mode. When you activate this option, you then get access to the PGXP tab with the rest of the PGXP options. Now, it's not just the geometry wireframe that suffered. The textures that sat on top of that wireframe also had a tendency to jitter and wobble about. And perspective correct textures is the thing that stops that from happening. If you are using geometry correction, it's generally recommended to always use perspective correct textures at the same time. Now, perspective correct colors is only for the vertex colors. And a vertex color you can kind of think as a texture that's pre-baked into an object, as this was better for performance and lighting back in the day. And even though the vertex colors can suffer from the same issues that the textures and polygons do, the average user is probably not even going to notice. So realistically, you'll leave this off by default and only use it if A, your game actually has vertex colors, because not all games do, B, it's actually an issue, and C, if you do use it, make sure that it doesn't break any rendering. Culling correction, you definitely want to leave on by default, as it plugs up any holes that using PGXP can create. Now, preserved projection precision, aside from being really difficult to say, adds additional precision to the entire PGXP chain, which can help to stabilize things even more. So for games like Vagrant Story, it helps to stabilize the character models specifically, even more than PGXP on its own. However, for games like Crash Team Racing, it will introduce holes in geometry, even with Culling Correction active. So this is another one that you want to test out on a per game basis to make sure that it doesn't break anything and it actually has a benefit. Now, CPU mode will use PGXP for all instructions, and there's quite a few games out there that require this to be active for PGXP to work at all. But again, DuckStation knows which games these are and will activate it for you. But CPU mode is something that I like to experiment with because it will stabilize things as much as it possibly can, even more so than PGXP on its own with preserved projection precision. However, if you do activate this for a game that doesn't need it, 9 times out of 10 it's going to break some form of graphics. But that 1 in 10 game that you do find where it stabilizes everything perfectly and breaks absolutely nothing, it is pretty glorious. So it's definitely worth trying out per game, but just know that it is a crapshoot. Other than that, you want to leave it off by default and let DuckStation turn it on for the games that need it. Vertex cache and disable on 2D polygons are compatibility options, and DuckStation knows which games these need to be active with and will turn them on for you. So leave them off by default, and your average user can just forget about them. Now, geometry tolerance, depth clear threshold, this option that's grayed out in the bottom right hand corner, and this depth buffer option in the rendering options are all related to each other. These are essentially geometry hacks to help fix issues when you're using PGXP, stuff like graphics being rendered at the wrong depth. But to be honest, all this stuff is more trouble than what it's worth. When you fix it for one object, it generally breaks another, and the compatibility for these hacks is super low. On top of that, the need for these hacks is diminishing over time. The games in the past that I noticed had issues, I've come back to fix, and they no longer have that issue, proving Stenzek has been hard at work. So we're going to move swiftly on, save ourselves an hour, and not sweat it. So now we're going to move on to the Advanced tab, and with the display options, borderless full screen is what is recommended, and you can change the screen position and rotation if you want to. Now, these 4 options are super specific, and the average user really doesn't need to factor them in. In the rendering options, we've got multi-sampling, which is anti-aliasing. But do keep in mind, if you're already using box downsampling for AA reasons, you do not need to use these, because you're already applying anti-aliasing in probably the best way possible, because these algorithms have the potential to break some graphics, whereas box downsampling via hardware scaling does not suffer from that same issue, making it much more of a solid solution. However, using downsampling does soften the image slightly, and a lot of us, including myself, actually prefer it that way. But I know there's going to be some of you out there that want to retain the full resolution that you've set internally with no downsampling or softening of the image. And you want anti-aliasing, and if that's you, you need to set it here. So we've got up to ×8 MSAA and ×8 SSAA. Between the two, SSAA looks much better, but it does eat up a hell of a lot more resources. But ultimately, you can just set this to whatever you want, so go with your preference or what your performance needs you to set. Now, line detection is a fix that only applies to certain games if you're upscaling beyond the native resolution. So we got Doom here at the native res, but if we upscale it, we introduce 1 pixel wide black lines into the majority of textures. And we need to get rid of these with line detection. There's 3 different options, but it's not preference. It's just what works the best. So I already know ahead of time that for build style games that suffer from this issue, like Duke Nukem, Hexen and Doom here, the best option to use is Triangle's Aggressive. But again, DuckStation does know what the majority of games that suffer from this issue are and will set it up accordingly for you, including Doom here. But there may be a couple of games that slip through the net, so if you see those fine black lines in any texture, you should be able to get rid of it with line detection. But for the most part, you want to leave this disabled and only set it up if you have that issue, and the likelihood that's going to happen is super low. Wireframe Mode is pretty self-explanatory, and you can even overlay it if you want to. Round upscaled texture coordinates is another fix that you only need to use if you're upscaling beyond the native resolution. So we got Crash Bandicoot at the native res, but if we upscale this, as you can see, the textures become misaligned, especially on this bottom crate. But if we come over to the Advanced tab and activate round upscaled texture coordinates, it fixes that issue. This is another one that DuckStation should set for you, including for Crash Bandicoot here, so it's definitely worth keeping this off by default and letting DuckStation turn it on for the games that need it. Scaled interlacing helps with the 480i games, and the only thing you need to know with this is that you need to leave it active. So now we've pretty much gone through every single graphics option, we can now move on to VSync and latency control in the emulation options. So if you're using a G-Sync or a FreeSync monitor, the only thing you need to activate in here is optimal frame pacing, and maybe reduce input latency if any has been added. If you're just using a normal 60Hz display, you need to activate vertical sync to get rid of the screen tearing. Now because the native refresh rate for PS1 games is slightly slower than the refresh rate for your display, it can cause micro stuttering, but sync to host refresh rate is here to solve that issue. This allows the emulation to speed up by up to 1%, bridging the gap between the two, which will remove the micro stuttering and provide you with the smoothest possible frame rate and animations. After messing around with this, I noticed it works better with certain graphics backends. For my hardware, OpenGL worked the best with it, Vulkan was a close second, and Direct3D 11, unfortunately, it wasn't that stable. This could be completely different for your hardware, but just know that this may respond better to certain graphics backends. When it comes to setting up your defaults, if you want to copy what I do, here's what I've got set for my rendering, advanced and PGXP tab. But I set all of this up knowing I'm going to be changing a lot of it on a game by game basis. For this video, that's everything I want to cover. But of course, DuckStation can do so much other stuff. Things like shaders, HD textures, overclocking for a solid frame rate, removing input lag, and bezels and overlays. And I've got individual videos for each of these things that I'll link in the description below. So from this point, you can just choose your own adventure. If this video actually helped you out, slam it a like, and if you want to keep up to date with the channel, you know what to do. And apart from that, go play some games. Adios.